Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the lines are drawn in the dust, and sometimes, to save everything you love, you have to shake hands with the devil you know. Tonight's tale is about a man of principle, consumed by a righteous hatred, who is forced to make an impossible choice. It's the story of a cattleman's secret alliance, and a war fought in the shadows with the very enemy he once swore to destroy. The high plains of the Montana Territory were a testament to God's grandest and cruelest impulses. They were vast, beautiful, and utterly unforgiving. For Jesse Clayton, this land was not just a place to live, it was a creed, a promise written in the rustle of the tall grass and the endless expanse of the sky. His ranch, the Circle C, was the culmination of a lifetime of sweat, grit, and unwavering principle. Jesse was known throughout the valley as a man as solid and unyielding as the granite peaks of the Bighorn Mountains that watched over his domain. His word was his bond, and his sense of justice was as sharp and as clear as a winter morning. This clarity, however, was born from a profound and terrible darkness. 5 years ago, that darkness had a name: Cole Cutter Harding and his Red River Gang. They were not common rustlers, they were a plague, a swarm of locusts that descended on the hard work of honest men and left only ruin in their wake. They had hit the Circle C at dusk, a whirlwind of gunfire and chaos, their aim not just to steal cattle, but to break the spirit of the land itself. The memory was a brand on Jesse's soul, a scene that played out behind his eyes in the quiet hours of the night. The terror in the eyes of his cattle as they stampeded, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the splintering wood of his corral, and the image of his younger brother, Daniel, barely a man of 19, trying to turn the herd, his face a mask of youthful determination. A single, careless shot from one of Cutter's men had sent Daniel's horse into a panicked frenzy. The fall had been a sickening, final thud. Jesse had reached him in moments, but it was too late. Daniel had looked up at him, his eyes wide with a surprise that was quickly fading into the great, empty void. He had tried to speak, but only a bloody froth had come from his lips. Jesse had held him as the life drained out of him, the dust of the corral turning to a dark, crimson mud beneath them. In the aftermath, amidst the wreckage of his ranch and the shattered pieces of his heart, Jesse Clayton had made a vow. He had made it to his grieving parents, to his terrified wife, Sarah, and to the silent, accusing spirit of his dead brother. He had sworn on Daniel's grave that he would not rest until Cutter Harding and every last member of the Red River Gang were either dead or swinging from a hangman's rope. This was not a secret oath. It was a public declaration, a stone cast into the pond of the valley's consciousness, its ripples touching every rancher and townsfolk. The feud between Jesse Clayton and the Red River Gang became a part of the local lore, a fixed point in their universe. Jesse's hatred was a pure, white-hot thing, a righteous fire that fueled him. He hunted them relentlessly, his patrols pushing the boundaries of his own land, his name becoming a curse in the Outlaws camps. There were skirmishes, gunfights in remote canyons that left men dead on both sides, each encounter deepening the river of blood that flowed between them. Jesse's integrity remained, but it was now tempered with a hard, cold edge. He was a good man, but he was a man at war. 5 years had passed, and the war had settled into a grim stalemate. Cutter's gang was weakened, more cautious, their raids less frequent and further afield. The Circle C was stronger than ever, a fortress built on a foundation of grief and resolve. Jesse, now with a young son of his own, Tom, had even more to protect. The fire of his hatred had not diminished, it had simply banked, its embers glowing with a patient, deadly heat, waiting for the wind of opportunity to whip it back into a raging inferno. He was a man defined by his vow, a man whose identity was inextricably linked to the destruction of his sworn enemy. And in the harsh and compromising world of the West, he could not imagine a single circumstance, a single cataclysm, that could ever force him to change. The first sign of the new trouble was a whisper on the wind, a rumor that traveled from a lone prospector to a chatty bartender and finally to the ears of the valley's ranchers. It was a story of a new power in the territory, a force that didn't ride with masks and guns, but with legal documents and survey maps. The name on those documents was Bartholomew Thorne, and the name of his enterprise was the Blackstone Land and Cattle Syndicate. Thorne was a new breed of predator, a vulture who wore a silk vest and smelled of expensive cigars. He wasn't an outlaw who stole what you had, he was a businessman who proved, with a stack of papers and a team of smiling, cold-eyed lawyers, that you never truly had it in the first place. He had a charter, granted by a corrupt territorial government, that gave him claim to vast swaths of land, claims that superseded the simple, hand-scrawled deeds held by the families who had bled and sweat to tame the wilderness. At first, the ranchers of the valley, Jesse included, dismissed it as a problem for other, less established regions. Their claims were solid, their community strong, but then, the shadow of the vulture fell upon them. It began with the Miller Place, a small ranch at the southern edge of the valley. Thorne's men arrived, not a gang of outlaws, but a disciplined, uniformed force who called themselves the Blackstone Regulators. They were led by a man named Cowboy, a former Pinkerton with a face devoid of any emotion and eyes that were like chips of ice. They didn't raid the Millers, they evicted them. They produced a legal document, stamped and sealed, that declared the Millers' deed invalid. When Old Man Miller protested, they didn't argue. They simply threw his belongings into the dirt and set fire to his house, the flames a stark, brutal message to the rest of the valley. Panic began to spread like a prairie fire. Jesse called a meeting of the ranchers. He stood before them, his voice a low, steady rumble of defiance, urging them to stand together, to fight this new, insidious threat. But he saw the fear in their eyes. This was not an enemy they understood. Cutter Harding and his outlaws were a known quantity, a physical threat that could be met with guns and grit. But how do you shoot a legal document? How do you hang a syndicate? Bartholomew Thorne himself made an appearance in the nearby town of Redemption, setting up his headquarters in the finest suite of the hotel. He was a portly, impeccably dressed man who spoke with a smooth, Eastern accent. He invited the ranchers to a meeting, where he laid out his generous offer. He would buy their land for 10 cents on the dollar. It was not a negotiation, it was a demand. "This valley is destined for greatness," Thorne had said, his voice dripping with a condescending magnanimity. "A new railroad is coming through, and the Blackstone Syndicate will bring prosperity, order, and civilization to this rustic frontier. You can either be a part of that future, or you can be a relic of the past. The choice is yours." The threat was clear, wrapped in the silken glove of progress. The local law sheriff Miller, a good man but a weak one, was powerless, his authority dwarfed by the syndicate's legal and financial power. As Thorne's regulators began to systematically apply pressure, strangling the valley with legal notices and armed patrols, Jesse noticed a strange, new development. The raids from the Red River Gang stopped completely. Their usual territory, the canyons and badlands to the east, grew quiet. It was an unsettling silence, the kind that comes before a storm. The reason became clear when one of Jesse's men, scouting the eastern passes, reported seeing the Blackstone Regulators in force, not patrolling the valley, but sweeping through the badlands. They weren't just evicting ranchers, they were clearing out anyone who didn't fit into Thorne's vision of order and civilization. That included the outlaws. Thorne wasn't just taking the valley, he was sanitizing it. He was a force of nature, a wildfire that consumed everything in its path, the law-abiding and the lawless alike. The enemy of Jesse's enemy was not his friend. It was a bigger, more monstrous enemy, a dragon that had come to devour them all. One evening, as Jesse sat on his porch, cleaning his Winchester, the weight of the coming storm heavy on his shoulders, he saw a lone rider approaching. The rider was not from the valley. He was a hard-faced man with the wary eyes of a hunted animal. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from the house and dismounted, his hands held away from his gun. "Jesse Clayton," the man asked, his voice a low growl. "I am," Jesse said, his rifle resting casually across his lap. "I bring a message," the man said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, holding it up for Jesse to see. From Cutter Harding. Jesse's blood ran cold. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. A message. From the man who had murdered his brother. The man he had sworn to kill. "He wants a meeting," the writer said. "He says you and him have a common problem. A problem by the name of Bartholomew Thorne." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was staggering. Jesse's first instinct was to shoot the writer where he stood, to send his answer back to Cutter in a hail of lead. The vow he had made 5 years ago screamed in his soul, a righteous, furious protest. But as he looked past the writer, at the ranch his father had built, at the house where his wife and son were sleeping, at the land that was his very soul, he felt anew. Colder emotion began to creep in, chilling the white-hot fire of his hatred. It was a pragmatic, terrifying fear. Thorn was a dragon, and Jesse Clayton, for all his strength and resolve, was just one man. And one man, he knew, could not slay a dragon alone. To save his world, he was being asked to consider the unthinkable, to entertain a proposition from the devil himself. The coming storm had just presented him with a choice that would tear his very soul in two. The piece of paper the writer had delivered felt like a venomous snake in Jesse's hand. The scrawled message was brief and to the point. Thorn is killing us both. Meet me. Sundown 2 days. The old mission at Silver Creek. Come alone. It was signed with a simple, arrogant C. Jesse's immediate, visceral reaction was to burn it, to pretend the proposition had never been made. To meet with Cutter Harding would be a desecration of his brother's memory, a betrayal of the vow that had become the central pillar of his life. He spent the night pacing the floor of his study, the crumpled note a malevolent presence on his desk, the ghost of his brother a silent, accusing figure in the corner of the room. He thought of Daniel's face, pale and blood-streaked in the dust. He thought of the cold, final weight of his brother's body in his arms. The hatred, pure and righteous, surged through him, and he knew he could not do it. He would rather lose his ranch, his life, fighting Thorn alone than to spit on Daniel's grave by shaking hands with his murderer. He was loading his shotgun, his mind made up to ride out and hunt down the messenger, to send his answer back in a spray of buckshot, when Sarah entered the study. She was wrapped in a dressing gown, her face pale in the pre-dawn light, her eyes filled with a deep, knowing sadness. She had been watching him, listening to him pace, and she knew the war that was raging in his soul. "You can't fight them alone, Jesse," she said, her voice a soft, gentle counterpoint to the storm in his mind. "I won't make a deal with him, Sarah," he growled, his voice thick with a mixture of grief and rage. "I won't. It would be like Daniel died for nothing." "Daniel died because a bad man did a terrible thing," she said, her hand resting on his arm, her touch a small, calming anchor. "His death will mean nothing if you let your pride and your anger lead to the death of our son, and the destruction of everything we've built." Her words were a cruel, necessary truth. She was not asking him to forgive, or to forget. She was asking him to be a husband and a father first, and an avenger second. "What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice breaking with the weight of his impossible choice. "Sit down with the man who took my brother from me. Shake his hand." "I would have you listen," she said, her gaze unwavering. "That's all. You don't have to make any promises. You don't have to agree to anything. But you have to know your enemy. All of them. You have to understand the shape of the battlefield before you ride into the fight." She picked up the crumpled note. "This is not a betrayal of Daniel, Jesse. This is a chance to be smart. A chance to survive." He knew she was right. His vow had been one of passion, of a righteous, all-consuming fury. But the situation had changed. The simple, black and white world of his feud with Cutter had been complicated by a new, more profound shade of gray. To honor his dead brother, he had to protect his living son. And if that meant listening to the devil, then that was a price he would have to be willing to pay. The 2-day ride to the old mission at Silver Creek was a journey through a personal hell. Every mile was a torment, every hoofbeat a betrayal. He told his men he was scouting a new route for a cattle drive, a lie that tasted like ash in his mouth. He rode alone, his only companions the ghosts of his past and the uncertainties of his future. The mission was a skeleton, its adobe walls crumbling, its bell tower a silent, lonely finger pointing to the sky. It was a place of ghosts, a fitting location for a meeting between two men who were haunted by their own violent histories. He arrived just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery, bloody hues. He dismounted, his rifle in his hand, his senses on high alert. He saw a single horse tethered in the ruins of the old chapel. He was here. Jesse walked into the chapel, the setting sun casting his long, solitary shadow before him. Cutter Harding was standing by the remains of the altar, his back to him. He was taller than Jesse remembered, leaner, his duster coated with the dust of a hard life. Cutter turned, and for the first time in 5 years, the two men stood face to face. Cutter's face was a roadmap of a violent life, a scar an inch from his left eye giving him a permanent, malevolent sneer. But his eyes, they were not the eyes of a mad dog killer. They were the eyes of a wolf, intelligent, wary, and filled with a cold, pragmatic understanding of the world. "Clayton," Cutter said, his voice a low, gravelly sound. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I'm not here to make friends, Harding," Jesse said, his voice as hard and as cold as a stone. "I'm here to listen. And then I'm here to leave." "Fair enough," Cutter said with a humorless smile. He gestured to the open, empty space around them. "No tricks. No men hiding in the shadows. Just you and me. And a common problem." "Thorn," Jesse said, "the name a curse." "Thorn," Cutter agreed, his smile disappearing. "He's a different breed of snake. He doesn't just want the gold in your safe. He wants the ground your safe is sitting on. He wants the whole damn world." He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Jesse's. "His regulators hit one of my camps a week ago. Wiped it out. They weren't trying to arrest anyone. They were exterminating. He's closing the game down, Clayton. For all of us." The idea of Cutter Harding, the predator, being hunted himself was a strange, disorienting concept. "This is not my problem, Harding," Jesse said, his voice a low growl. "Isn't it?" Cutter countered, his voice sharp. "He burned out the Millers. He's choking your neighbors with his legal papers. How long do you think it will be before he comes for the Circle C? A month? A week? He sees you as the leader of the resistance in this valley. He will come for you. And when he does, he won't come with a handful of riders. He'll come with an army." Everything Cutter said was true. Jesse knew it. But the ghost of his brother stood between them, a silent, insurmountable barrier. "I swore an oath on my brother's grave, Harding," Jesse said, his voice thick with a raw, barely controlled emotion. "I swore I would see you dead." Cutter's face hardened, the brief, fleeting moment of potential camaraderie gone. "I remember your brother," he said, his voice quiet, but not apologetic. "He was brave. And foolish. My man was jumpy. The shot was a mistake. But in our world, Clayton, mistakes get people killed. That's the hard truth of it." He took another step closer, their faces now only a few feet apart. "You can hold on to your oath. You can try to kill me. And while we're busy tearing each other apart, Thorn will come and pick our bones clean. Or we can be smart. We can be survivors." He held out his hand. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to be my friend. I'm proposing a truce. An alliance. Just until Thorn is dealt with. We fight him together. And when it's over we can go back to trying to kill each other. What do you say, Clayton? Do you want your vengeance more than you want your son to have a home to grow up in?" The question was a brutal, perfectly in blow. Jesse looked at Cutter's outstretched hand, the hand of his brother's killer. And he thought of his son Tom, his innocent, sleeping face. He thought of his wife, her quiet strength. He thought of his ranch, his legacy. With a heart that felt like it was being torn in two, with a soul that screamed in protest, he slowly, reluctantly, raised his own hand and clasped Cutter's in a firm, cold grip. It was not a handshake of friendship or of forgiveness. It was a deal with the devil, a devil's handshake to fight a demon. The unthinkable proposition had been accepted, and Jesse Clayton, the man of principle, had just taken his first, terrifying step into a world of shadow and compromise. The handshake was brief, the contact of their skin a jarring and natural thing. As Jesse pulled his hand back, he felt a profound sense of self-loathing. He had not just clasped the hand of his enemy, he had shaken hands with a version of himself he no longer recognized. A man who could compromise on a vow that had been carved into the very bedrock of his soul. "So, we have a deal," Cutter said, his voice all business, the brief, intense moment of personal confrontation already in the past. For him, this was not a moral crisis, it was a tactical necessity. "We have a truce," Jesse corrected him, his voice a low, hard growl. "Don't ever mistake it for anything else. This is about Thorn. And only about Thorn." "Understood," Cutter said with a curt nod. He began to pace in the ruins of the chapel, his mind already working, a general planning a campaign. Thorn's strength is his organization, and his numbers. His weakness is his arrogance. He thinks we're all just ignorant sodbusters and penny anti-outlaws. He won't be expecting us to work together. "How do we do this?" Jesse asked. The practicalities of the alliance a welcome distraction from the turmoil in his own heart. "My men would sooner shoot yours on sight than work with them. And my men feel the same way about yours," Cutter countered. This has to be a secret. Just you and me. We'll be the only point of contact. We share information. We coordinate our actions. But our men never mix. Not until they have to. It was a sensible plan, the only one that had any chance of working. But it meant that Jesse would have to lie to his own men, to the people who had placed their trust in him. The path of compromise was already leading him into a forest of deceit. Information is the key, Cutter continued, his voice sharp, analytical. My men are ghosts. They know how to move in scene, how to listen at keyholes. They can be my eyes and ears inside Thorne's operation. Your men, your ranchers, they are the muscle. When the time comes to fight, they are the ones who will have to stand their ground. We need to know when and where Thorne plans to strike next. They spent the next hour in the fading light, two mortal enemies hunched over a crude map that Cutter had drawn in the dust, their heads close together, their voices low, urgent. They were two generals from opposing armies, forced by a common threat to share their strategies, their strengths, their weaknesses. They agreed on a system of communication, a series of dead drops, hidden caches in remote locations where they could leave messages for each other. They agreed on a signal, a way to call for an emergency meeting. And they agreed on their first joint operation, a small, surgical strike designed to test their newfound alliance and to send a message to Bartholomew Thorne. Thorne is bringing in a shipment of new rifles for his regulators, Cutter said, pointing to a spot on the dusty map. They're coming in on a wagon train, through the Diablo Pass, 3 nights from now. A light guard. They're not expecting any trouble. We hit them, Jesse said, the old, familiar instincts of a fighter taking over. We take the rifles. Exactly, Cutter said, a flicker of admiration in his wolf's eyes. My men will stop the wagon, create a diversion. Your men, positioned in the rocks above, will provide the covering fire. It will be fast, clean. We take the guns, we disappear. Thorne gets a bloody nose, and his regulators will be outgunned when the real fight begins. It was a good plan, a classic Outlaws ambush. The irony of it was a bitter pill for Jesse to swallow. He, Jesse Clayton, the pillar of the community, was about to plan and execute a raid on a wagon train. The line between him and Cutter was becoming dangerously, terrifyingly thin. 3 nights, Jesse said, his voice a low, final confirmation. He turned to leave, the meeting over. Clayton, Cutter called out, his voice stopping Jesse in his tracks. One more thing. For this to work you have to trust me. And I have to trust you. Jesse turned and looked at him, his face a hard and readable mask. I don't trust you, Harding, he said, his voice as cold and as sharp as a shard of glass. And if you're smart, you won't trust me either. This isn't about trust. It's about survival. And as long as we both want to survive, this alliance will hold. The moment that changes, all bets are off. He left without another word, mounting his horse and riding out of the ruined mission, the devil's handshake a cold, tingling sensation on his skin. The ride back to the Circle C was a journey of a different kind of torment. He had made his deal. Now, he had to live with it. He had to lie to his men, to his friends, to the very people he was trying to protect. He gathered a half-dozen of his most trusted hands, men who had fought beside him for years, including his loyal, grizzled foreman, Hank. He told them a half-truth. He told them he had received a tip from a reliable source about the rifle shipment. He told them it was a chance to arm themselves, to strike a blow against Thorne. He saw the questions in their eyes, the unspoken doubts. Where had the tip come from? Why the secrecy? But they were loyal men. They trusted Jesse. And if he said this was what needed to be done, then they would do it. Hank, however, was harder to convince. This feels wrong, Jesse, the old foreman said, his eyes shrewd, missing nothing. This ain't your style. This is the kind of move an outlaw would make. These are desperate times, Hank, Jesse said, his gaze unwavering, his voice a little too hard. And desperate times call for desperate measures. Are you with me, or not? I'm with you, boss, Hank said, though the doubt still lingered in his eyes. To the end of the line, the fragile trust Jesse had built his life on was already beginning to fray, stretched thin by the weight of his terrible secret. The devil's handshake had been made, and now the first payment was due. A payment that would be made in deceit, in secrecy, and, in 3 nights' time, in a hail of gunfire in a place called Diablo Pass. The 3 days leading up to the raid on the rifle shipment were a slow, grinding torment for Jesse. He was a man living a double life, the chasm between his public persona and his secret actions growing wider with every passing hour. By day, he was Jesse Clayton, the steadfast leader of the valley's resistance, organizing patrols, reinforcing his ranch, a beacon of defiance against the encroaching darkness of the Blackstone Syndicate. But by night, he was a conspirator, a man who met with shadows and planned like an outlaw. He checked the dead drop, a hollowed-out log in a remote ravine, twice. The first time, he found a note from Cutter, confirming the time and the route of the wagon train. The second time, he left a note of his own, confirming that his men would be in position. The act of leaving the note felt like an act of treason, a betrayal of everything he had ever stood for. The whispers and the sideways glances from his own men were a constant, grating presence. They were loyal, but they were not fools. They knew something was different. Jesse was more secretive, more intense, his eyes holding a new, darker light. His foreman, Hank, was the most watchful, his grizzled face a mask of a deep, troubled concern. He and Jesse had worked side by side for 20 years, and he knew his boss better than any man alive. He knew that a part of Jesse was at war with himself, and he feared, with a deep, paternalistic dread, which side would win. The night of the raid was dark and moonless, a perfect night for thieves. Jesse and his 6 men rode into the high, rocky terrain of the Diablo Pass, their horses' hooves muffled by rags they had tied around them. They took up their positions in the rocks high above the narrow trail, their rifles resting on the cold stone, their faces grim in the darkness. It was a strange, unsettling reversal of roles. For years, Jesse had been the one hunting men like these, the one setting the traps. Now, he was the one lying in ambush, waiting in the darkness to strike at a legitimate, if corrupt, enterprise. The wait was a tense, nerve-wracking affair. Every rustle of the wind, every cry of a distant coyote, sounded like the approach of the wagon. Finally, in the deep silence of the pre-dawn hours, they heard it, the rumble of wagon wheels, the jingle of harnesses, the low, tired voices of the drivers. A single wagon, pulled by a team of 4 horses, lumbered into view, flanked by 4 armed outriders. The Blackstone Regulators. They rode with a lazy, arrogant confidence, secure in the belief that they were the masters of this territory. Jesse raised a hand, a silent signal to his men to hold their fire. According to the plan, Cutter's men were to make the first move. He scanned the rocks on the opposite side of the pass, searching for any sign of his new and welcome allies. He saw nothing. A cold knot of fear tightened in his gut. Had he been played? Was this a trap? Was Cutter at this very moment riding down on the Circle C, knowing that Jesse and his best men were miles away, on a fool's errand? The fragile trust, which had never been more than a hopeful prayer, began to crumble. And then, it happened. A series of explosions erupted on the trail ahead of the wagon, not dynamite, but smaller, diversionary charges that sent rocks and dust flying, spooking the horses and throwing the Regulators into a state of panicked confusion. From the rocks on the other side of the pass, Cutter's men appeared, their faces covered by bandanas, their guns blazing. But they were not firing at the Regulators. They were firing into the air, creating a storm of noise and chaos, a perfect diversion. It was Jesse's turn. Now, he yelled, his voice a sharp crack in the night. His men opened up, their fire not aimed at the men, but at the ground in front of their horses, kicking up a storm of dust and rock chips, forcing the Regulators to dismount and take cover behind the wagon. It was a perfectly executed plan. The Regulators were pinned down, confused, caught in a crossfire that was more noise than substance. In the chaos, 2 of Cutter's men, moving with a silent, practiced speed, slipped down to the wagon, cut the lead horses free, and led them away into the darkness. Jesse and his men laid down a continuous, covering fire, their bullets peppering the rocks around the wagon, keeping the Regulators' heads down. Cutter's men, their work done, melted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. "That's it," Jesse yelled. "Let's go." He and his men scrambled down from their perch, mounted their horses, and rode away into the night, leaving behind a confused, leaderless, and thoroughly humiliated group of Blackstone Regulators, and a wagon filled with rifles that they could no longer move. They met at a prearranged rendezvous point a few miles away, a hidden box canyon that was one of Cutter's old hideouts. As they rode in, they saw Cutter and his men, their bandanas now off, transferring the stolen rifles to a string of pack horses. For the first time, the two groups, the ranchers and the outlaws, stood face to face. The air was thick with a tense, hostile silence. They were allies, but they were also mortal enemies, and the hatred that had defined their relationship for so long was a palpable, dangerous force. Cutter walked over to Jesse, a humorless grin on his face. "Like taking candy from a baby," he said. "It went according to plan," Jesse said, his voice a low, non-committal growl. He looked at his men, at Hank, whose face was a mask of a dawning, horrified understanding. The old foreman was looking at the outlaws, at their familiar, hated faces. And then he was looking at Jesse. The whispers of treason had just been given a voice, a face, and a name. "What is this, Jesse?" Hank demanded, his voice a low, pained whisper. "What have you done?" Before Jesse could answer, Cutter stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Your boss is a smart man, old-timer," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "He knows that sometimes you have to dance with the devil to keep the wolves from the door." The fragile alliance, which had survived its first test in the crucible of battle, was now facing a new, more dangerous threat. Not from the outside, but from within. The whispers of treason were about to become a roar, and Jesse knew that holding this unholy alliance together would be a far harder fight than any gun battle in the dark. The ride back to the Circle C was a silent, funereal procession. The victory in Diablo Pass felt hollow, tainted by the secret it had exposed. Hank rode beside Jesse, the comfortable silence that had defined their 20-year friendship replaced by a heavy, accusatory quiet. The other men rode behind them, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and a dawning, angry resentment. They had fought alongside the Red River Gang, the very men who had helped murder Daniel Clayton. They had followed their boss into a deal with the devil, and the smell of sulfur was now clinging to them all. When they reached the ranch, Hank confronted Jesse in the barn. The new, stolen Winchesters a silent, damning testament to their unholy alliance. "I have a right to know, Jesse," the old foreman said, his voice shaking with a barely controlled emotion. "After all these years after Daniel, how could you? How could you stand with him?" Jesse looked at his oldest friend, at the pain and the betrayal in his eyes, and he knew that the half-truths and the deceptions were over. He owed this man the truth. He told him everything. He told him about the meeting at the mission, about Thorne's plan to exterminate everyone in the valley, outlaw and rancher alike. He told him about the impossible choice he had been forced to make, the choice between his vow and his family's survival. Hank listened, his face a hard, unreadable mask. When Jesse had finished, the old man was silent for a long, agonizing moment. He looked at the stolen rifles, then back at Jesse. "I don't like it," he finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I don't like it one bit. It feels like a betrayal of the boy." But he sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of the whole damned world. "I also know that Thorne will kill us all if we don't stop him. And if you say this is the only way, then I will stand with you. But God help you, Jesse, if that snake, Harding, turns on us." It was not a full-throated endorsement, but it was enough. Hank's loyalty, though strained, had held. He would help Jesse keep the secret, help him manage the other men. The alliance, for now, was secure from within. But their victory had not gone unnoticed. Bartholomew Thorne was not a man who took humiliation well. The loss of his rifle shipment was not just a logistical setback, it was a personal insult. He had underestimated the resistance in the valley. He would not make that mistake again. The noose began to tighten. Thorne brought in more regulators, a new batch of hard-faced, professional killers recruited from the dregs of the mining camps and the border towns. The Blackstone presence in the valley doubled overnight. They were no longer just a force of intimidation, they were an army of occupation. They began to apply a new, more brutal kind of pressure. They impounded a herd of cattle from a neighboring ranch, claiming they had strayed onto Blackstone property. They diverted a stream, cutting off the water supply to another. They were strangling the valley, slowly, methodically, and legally. And then, Thorne made it personal. One afternoon, Sarah and young Tom were riding back from a visit to a neighbor. 2 Blackstone regulators appeared on the trail, blocking their path. They didn't draw their guns. They didn't make any overt threats. They just sat on their horses, their faces cold, impassive masks, and stared. It was a silent, chilling message, a demonstration that Thorne could get to Jesse's family anytime he wanted. When Sarah told him what had happened, a new, colder, and more personal rage filled Jesse's soul. This was no longer about land or about principles. This was about the safety of his wife and his son. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not protect them alone. He rode out that night to an emergency meeting with Cutter, his heart a cold, hard knot of fear and fury. He found the outlaw leader in a state of barely controlled rage himself. Thorne had escalated his war onto fronts. The regulators had found and destroyed Cutter's main encampment, a hidden fortress in the Badlands that had been his base of operations for a decade. They had not just attacked it, they had salted the earth, poisoned the well, ensuring that it could never be used again. "He's not just trying to drive us out, Clayton," Cutter snarled, pacing back and forth like a caged wolf. "He's trying to erase us. He's declared war on our very existence." "He threatened my family," Jesse said, his voice a low, deadly monotone. The 2 men, the rancher and the outlaw, stood in the darkness, their personal hatred for each other momentarily eclipsed by the shared, overwhelming threat of a common enemy. "We have to hit him, and we have to hit him hard," Cutter said, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "We have to hit him in a way that he can't ignore. We have to hit him where he lives." "His headquarters," Jesse said, his mind already working, the cold, tactical part of his brain taking over. "The hotel in Redemption." "Exactly," Cutter said. "But we can't just charge in. The town is crawling with his men. We need a diversion. Something big. Something that will draw the regulators out of the town and leave Thorne exposed." They began to plan, their 2 minds, one disciplined and strategic, the other cunning and improvisational, working together with a new, more desperate synergy. They would create a diversion that Thorne could not ignore, a cattle stampede, aimed directly at the new railroad spur that was Thorne's pride and joy. While the regulators were scrambling to deal with the chaos at the railhead, a small, elite team, led by Jesse and Cutter themselves, would slip into the town, get into the hotel, and take Thorne. It was a bold, reckless, and incredibly dangerous plan, but they were out of options. The noose was tightening, and this was their last, best chance to cut it. As Jesse rode back to the Circle C, he knew that the Alliance had entered a new, more dangerous phase. This was no longer a war of skirmishes and secret raids. This was a direct assault on the heart of the enemy. The Devil's Handshake was about to be sealed in a final, bloody confrontation. And Jesse, the man of peace, was now the co-commander of a desperate, last-ditch attack, fighting side by side with the men he had sworn to destroy, for the very soul of the land they both, in their own twisted ways, called home. The days leading up to the assault on Redemption were filled with a tense, almost unbearable quiet. It was the calm before the storm, a period of meticulous planning and silent, personal reflection. The valley held its breath, the air thick with unspoken knowledge that a final, violent reckoning was at hand. The Circle C ranch was transformed into a military encampment. Jesse gathered his men, and the few other ranchers who had not yet been broken by Thorne's campaign of fear, and for the first time, he told them the full truth. He told them about his alliance with Cutter, about the impossible choice he had made, and about the desperate plan they had concocted. The reaction was a stunned, angry silence. But Jesse was no longer the conflicted, uncertain man who had returned from Diablo Pass. He was a commander, his voice filled with a cold, hard authority. He laid out the stakes, not in terms of principles or of vengeance, but of survival. "I know what I'm asking of you," he said, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his men. "I'm asking you to ride with men you hate, to trust a man I swore to kill. But I'm also asking you to fight for your homes, for your families, for the very ground we stand on. Thorne will not stop until he has crushed us all. This is our last, best chance to hit back." Hank, his loyalty no longer in question, was the first to speak. "We ride with you, Jesse," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Wherever that may lead." One by one, the other men nodded their assent. They were scared, and they were angry, but they were ranchers, and they were fighters, and they trusted Jesse Clayton. The alliance, once a secret held by a few, was now out in the open, a strange and holy union forged in the crucible of a common threat. Jesse met with Cutter one last time, in the dead of night, in a windswept, forgotten place where the plains met the Badlands. It was a meeting not of enemies, but of two generals, their personal histories set aside in the face of the coming battle. They went over the plan, every detail, every contingency. Cutter's men, experts in chaos, would handle the cattle stampede. They would gather a herd from the open range, a massive, unstoppable force of nature, and drive them towards the railroad spur a few miles south of town. The sound and the fury of it, Cutter promised, would draw every regulator within 10 miles. Meanwhile, Jesse, Cutter, and a small, hand-picked team of their best men, 6 in total, 3 ranchers, 3 outlaws, would slip into the town, their objective the hotel suite of Bartholomew Thorne. They were not going to kill him, not if they could help it. They were going to take him hostage. They were going to use him as a bargaining chip to force the Blackstone Syndicate out of the valley for good. The plan was audacious, and the odds were long. But as the two men stood there, in the vast, silent darkness, a strange, unspoken understanding passed between them. They were two sides of the same coin, two men who had been shaped by the same harsh and forgiving land. They had chosen different paths, but their paths had led them to this same, desperate moment. "My brother's name was Daniel," Jesse said, the words coming out of him unbidden, a quiet, final acknowledgement of the ghost that stood between them. Cutter was silent for a long moment. "I know," he finally said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "I made it my business to know." He looked at Jesse, his wolf's eyes holding a flicker of something, a hint of a long-buried regret. "I've done a lot of things in my life I'm not proud of, Clayton. But that day, that was a bad day. A mistake. That's all I can tell you." It was not an apology. It was not an excuse. It was a simple, unadorned statement of a hard, brutal truth. And for the first time, Jesse felt the white-hot fire of his hatred cool, replaced by the cold, weary ashes of a shared, tragic past. They could never be friends. They could never erase the river of blood that flowed between them. But in this moment, on the eve of a battle that would decide their collective fate, they were, for the first time, equals. "See you in redemption," Jesse said, his voice a low, final confirmation. "See you in redemption," Cutter replied. As Jesse rode back to the Circle C, a strange sense of calm settled over him. The internal war that had been raging in his soul was over. He had made his choice. He had chosen the future over the past, his son over his brother, survival over vengeance. The price had been a piece of his own soul, a compromise on the rigid, black-and-white principles that had once defined him. But in doing so, he had become something more. He had become a leader, a man who was willing to do whatever it took, no matter how distasteful, no matter how dangerous, to protect his own. The final battle was coming. The calm was about to be shattered. But Jesse Clayton was ready. He was no longer just a cattleman. He was a warrior, and he was about to lead the strangest, most desperate army the West had ever seen into the heart of the storm. The night of the assault was as black as the inside of a sealed tomb. A low-hanging cloud cover had rolled in, swallowing the moon and the stars, a gift from a god that had not yet completely abandoned the valley. The air was heavy still, pregnant with the promise of violence. The plan was set in motion with a silent, deadly precision. Miles to the south, Cutter's men, phantoms on horseback, were gathering the herd. They were experts in the art of moving cattle, their whistles and calls a soft, secret language that the animals understood. They were building a force of nature, a thunderous, unstoppable wave of hoof and horn. At the Circle C, Jesse gathered his own small, elite team. Hank, his old foreman, his face a grim, stony mask. 2 of his best ranch hands, young men who were as good with a rifle as they were with a rope. And, to the surprise and the consternation of all, Cutter Harding himself, along with 2 of his most trusted lieutenants. The 6 of them stood in the barn, the air thick with a tense, almost unbearable silence. Rancher and outlaw side by side, their differences momentarily erased by the shared, deadly purpose of their mission. They were a single, lethal unit, an unholy alliance about to ride into the heart of the enemy's stronghold. "Remember the plan," Jesse said, his voice a low, steady command. "We go in quiet. We get to the hotel. We take Thorne. No shooting unless we have to. We are ghosts until the moment we strike. Cutter nodded his agreement. My men will make enough noise for the both of us, he said with a humorless grin. They rode out, a small, dark knot of men moving silently through the night. They left their horses a mile outside of Redemption and approached the town on foot, their boots making no sound on the soft, dusty earth. They were in position, hidden in the shadows of the blacksmith's forge at the edge of town, when the first, low rumble reached them. It was a sound that started in the soles of their feet, a deep, primal vibration that grew steadily in intensity. It was the sound of 1,000 angry hooves, the sound of the coming storm. The diversion had begun. The rumble grew to a roar, a thunderous, the shaking crescendo that was accompanied by the panicked, high-pitched bellows of the cattle. The ground itself seemed to tremble. And then, they came. A massive, dark river of cattle poured over the rise south of town, a stampede of biblical proportions, their eyes wild with terror, their horns a forest of sharpened daggers. They were aimed directly at the railroad spur, at the neat, orderly tracks and the newly built depot that were the symbols of Bartholomew Thorne's manifest destiny. The town of Redemption, which had been in a state of a tense, military lockdown, erupted into a new kind of chaos. Lights appeared in windows. Shouted, panicked orders echoed through the streets. The Blackstone regulators, who had been prepared for a frontal assault on the town, were now faced with a different kind of enemy, a mindless, unstoppable force of nature. Calloway, Thorne's chief enforcer, made a fatal, but predictable, mistake. He saw the threat to the railroad, to his boss's most prized investment, and he reacted. Whistles blew, orders were shouted, and the bulk of the regulators, a force of nearly 40 men, mounted up and thundered out of town, a futile, panicked attempt to turn a tide that could not be turned. It was the opening Jesse and Cutter had been waiting for. Now, Jesse said, his voice a low, urgent command. The 6 of them slipped out of the shadows and moved through the now chaotic, half-deserted streets of the town. They were ghosts, moving through a storm of someone else's making, their focus a single, unwavering point at the Grand Hotel, and the man in the suite on the top floor. The interior of the hotel was a study in panicked, half-finished flight. Trays of food lay overturned in the hallways, and the lobby was deserted, the night clerk having fled his post in the face of the chaos outside. The sound of the stampede, though more distant now, was still a constant, chaotic roar, a perfect soundtrack for their silent, deadly intrusion. They took the back stairs, their boots silent on the carpeted steps. They were a seamless unit, the ranchers and outlaws, their movements coordinated, their senses on high alert. The years of hatred that had separated them had been burned away, leaving only the pure, functional necessity of the mission. They reached the top floor, a single, nervous-looking regulator standing guard outside the double doors of Thorne's suite. He was a young man, his face pale, his eyes wide with the fear of the unknown. He was staring down the hallway, towards the sounds of the chaos, his back to them. Cutter's man, a weary, silent outlaw known only as Whisper, moved forward, his knife a dull gleam in the dim hallway light. Before Jesse could even register his intent, Whisper was on the guard, a hand clamped over his mouth, the knife a single, swift, and silent punctuation mark. The guard crumpled to the floor without a sound. Jesse felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was a necessary act, a casualty of war, but the cold, brutal efficiency of it was a stark reminder of the world his new allies came from. Cutter gave him a sharp, questioning look, as if to ask if he had the stomach for this. Jesse met his gaze and gave a curt, firm nod. He had made his choice. He would see it through to the end. They stacked up on either side of the door. On a silent signal from Jesse, they burst into the room. Bartholomew Thorne was standing by the window, a glass of brandy in his hand, looking down at the chaos in the streets below with an expression of angry, arrogant disbelief. He spun around as they entered, his face a mask of shock and a dawning, terrible fear. He was not a fighter. He was a vulture, a creature of balance sheets and legal documents. And a pack of wolves had just entered his nest. Who are you?" he stammered, the brandy glass slipping from his nerveless fingers and shattering on the plush carpet. "We're the past, mister Thorne," Jesse said, his voice a low, steady growl, his Colt leveled at the man's chest. "And we've come to collect on a debt." Thorne's eyes darted around the room, from the grim-faced ranchers to the cold-eyed outlaws. He saw Cutter, and a flicker of recognition, of a dawning, horrified understanding, crossed his face. "You and him," he said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and a grudging, almost professional, respect. "Clever. I underestimated you. That's a mistake you won't have the chance to make again," Cutter said, his own gun trained on Thorn. The plan was working. It was working perfectly. They had him. And then, it all went wrong. From a dark inside room, a bedroom they hadn't cleared, Cowboy, Thorn's chief enforcer, emerged. He was not a man to be panicked by a cattle stampede. He was a professional, a killer, and he had stayed to protect his boss. He held a shotgun in his hands, and he opened fire. The room exploded in a deafening roar, the buckshot tearing a devastating path across the suite. One of Cutter's men was thrown backwards, his chest a bloody ruin. Hank screamed and went down, clutching at his leg. Jesse and Cutter reacted instantly, diving for cover, their own guns barking in reply. The suite was suddenly a whirlwind of gunfire, splintering wood, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Cowboy was a machine, reloading and firing with a calm, deadly efficiency. He was a one-man army, and he was standing between them and their only way out. In the midst of the chaos, Thorn, his arrogance replaced by a cornered animal's desperate will to survive, made a run for the door. "Stop him," Jesse yelled. But they were pinned down, unable to get a clear shot. The plan was falling apart. Their victory was turning into a bloodbath, a trap. And then, something happened that would forever change the landscape of Jesse Clayton's soul. Cutter Harding, the outlaw, the murderer, the man Jesse had sworn to kill, did the unthinkable. He saw Thorn about to escape. He saw Jesse pinned down, unable to act. And he made a choice. With a roar that was a mixture of rage and a strange, desperate kind of valor, he rose from his cover and charged Cowboy, firing his pistol as he went. It was a suicide run. Cowboy turned the shotgun on him, and the resulting blast was a sickening, final sound. Cutter was lifted off his feet, his body slammed back against the wall, his life ending in a final, explosive act of sacrifice. But his desperate, final charge had given Jesse the opening he needed. As Cowboy turned his weapon on Cutter, Jesse rose from his own cover and fired twice. His shots were true. Cowboy staggered, a look of surprise on his face, before collapsing to the floor. The room was suddenly, shockingly silent, the only sound the ragged, painful breathing of the wounded. Thorn was gone. Cowboy was dead. And Cutter Harding, the man who had murdered Jesse's brother, had just given his own life to save him. The devil's due had been paid. But it had been paid in a currency that Jesse Clayton could never have imagined, a currency of sacrifice and a strange, terrible, and undeniable kind of honor. The battle was over, but the war in Jesse's own soul was just beginning. The silence in the ruined hotel suite was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with the smell of blood and spent gunpowder. Jesse stood in the center of the carnage, his mind a numb, chaotic blur. Thorn had escaped. The mission was a failure. But the cost was a staggering, soul-shattering thing. Hank was alive, the shotgun blast having torn through the muscle of his thigh, a painful but not a fatal wound. But Cutter and his two men were dead, their lives extinguished in a final, brutal spasm of violence. Jesse knelt beside the body of the man who had been his sworn enemy for 5 long years. He looked at Cutter's face, his features now peaceful in death, the hard, cruel lines softened. He was not a monster. He was just a man who had lived by a hard, violent code, and who had, in his final moments, chosen to die by it, in an act that defied every label Jesse had ever placed upon him. The vow of vengeance that had fueled Jesse for so long felt like a hollow, foolish thing now, a child's promise in a world that was infinitely more complicated, more tragic, and more terribly human than he had ever imagined. He and his remaining men, carrying a wounded Hank between them, slipped out of the hotel and back into the chaotic streets. The stampede had passed, leaving behind a trail of destruction, and the regulators were now streaming back into town, their faces a mixture of confusion and a dawning, angry understanding. They made it out of town just as the sun was beginning to rise, an easy dawn breaking over a valley that had been irrevocably changed. The news of what had happened spread through the valley like a slow-moving fire. Thorn, shaken but alive, had packed his bags and left, his grand plans for the valley in ruins. The heart of his operation, Cowboy, was dead, and his regulators, their confidence shattered, their leader gone, had dissolved, melting back into the wilderness from which they had come. The Blackstone Syndicate was broken. The valley was saved. But the victory was a somber, muted thing. The alliance, born of desperation, had ended in blood and sacrifice. The ranchers, who had once seen the world in the simple, stark terms of right and wrong, of good men and outlaws, now had to grapple with a new, more complicated truth. They had been saved by the very men they had once despised. In the weeks that followed, a new kind of peace settled over the valley. It was not the innocent and troubled peace of the past, but a quieter, more thoughtful peace, a peace that was tempered by the knowledge of what they had lost, and what they had, so narrowly, preserved. Jesse Clayton was a changed man. The fire of his hatred had been extinguished, replaced by a deep, weary wisdom. He had looked into the face of his enemy and had seen not a monster, but a reflection of his own capacity for violence, for desperation, and for a strange, unexpected kind of grace. He gave his brother, Daniel, a new epitaph. He carved it himself, on a new, smooth piece of river stone, and placed it at the head of his grave. It did not speak of vengeance. It said, simply, a good man who loved this land. He never spoke of Cutter Harding again. There was no grave to mark his passing, no stone to bear his name. But in the quiet, private corners of his own heart, Jesse built his own kind of monument to the outlaw who had, in the end, honored a code that was more profound than any law. The secret alliance had saved them all, but it had opened a new chapter in Jesse's life, a chapter where the hard, rigid lines of his old world had been blurred into a new, more challenging, and a more forgiving landscape. He was still a cattleman, still a man of principle, but his principles were now broader, his understanding of justice deeper, his heart, once so filled with a righteous, burning hatred, now open to the difficult, and ultimately more human, possibility of forgiveness. He was a man who had sworn a vow of destruction, and had, through an act of impossible grace, found a path to a quiet, and a very personal, kind of redemption. The West was still a hard and forgiving place, but for Jesse Clayton, it was no longer a world of black and white. And in that newfound complexity, he had, at last, found a kind of peace.